Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for your patronage, and apologies for not producing a video in so many weeks. I've been how can I say? I've been let hitherto, to use an old uh, expression. Actually, I think I've just used that expression correctly. But anyway, I've had some stuff to deal with, and also I've been doing a lot of research and stuff that sort of really consumed me. Now, some of you might be aware that I've got a condition called ADD and Tourette's, and these are very, very fun little things that can sort of get in the way of being a particularly productive person and stuff like that. Anyway, so in today's video, I want to discuss a specific Christian attitude, right, that angers me. It angers me profoundly. So many of us might have heard their expression, pray away the gay, right? And basically that embodies an attitude within the Christian community where people believe that you can just pray for something. You treat like God like a slot machine, right? Where you can just pray, and then if, like, specifically in the situation of a gay person, and that their gayness will just magically just disappear, okay? And that attitude, and this is something that I want my that everyone to understand, right? That is absolutely essential to understand. I want my gay friends to understand this. I want my heterosexual friends to understand this. I want everyone has to understand this, right? Because we all fail in this regard, even though we are not religious. Is that people make this error, this attitude of pray away the gay, right? Where for the Christians, that like with homosexuality, you can just pray it away and there's no more extra work that needs to be done, right, in order to help the person deal with an issue. You see this with depression, for example. So there's someone very close to me. I was with her at church, right, and one of our church fellow people asked her, well, are you still depressed, right? She suffers from severe depression. Are you still depressed, right? And she's like, you don't just, doesn't just magically just go away. Oh, well, you clearly haven't prayed hard enough, all right? I wanted to punch this woman in the teeth, okay, for the sheer ignorance. So it's not only with homosexuality that Christians do this, it is with all disorders, all issues, right? If you're an alcoholic, if you are obese, if you're, or every single disorder that there is, they think you can just pray and just off it goes, right? And magic, poof, God just makes a miracle. He's like a slot machine. People do the same thing. Well, if I pray hard enough for God to make me rich, then he's going to make me rich. And you've got then prosperity gospels and all that kind of stuff. That is not how this works, right? And almost like there's nothing extra to be done. And some people even go to the extremes, right, where they will deny, for like a physical disease, they will deny medical treatment, right? And say, well, I'll just pray for the disease to go away, and then they die, sort of thing. The imbecile, right? Just because you can pray to God and God has healing abilities and all of these kinds of things does not mean that there's nothing on your part to be done in order to sort certain things out, okay, at all. And the nature of how you go about sorting these things out is then also an issue. So, for example, when they say pray away the gay, right, they basically is like, there's a behavior that we find unacceptable, and people are targeting the behavior, right? And this is not only with homosexuality, this is with alcoholism. So you see a person who's an alcoholic, you see the behavior is unacceptable, it ruins the person's life, whatever the case might be, and people try to come down on the individual because of the behavior. But one thing that people have been hitherto too stupid or too ignorant or disinterested in understanding is why is the person that way in the first place, right? Because if you don't understand why they're that way in the first place, you won't be able to help them. End of story. End of story. Because when you look at the final analysis of all of these issues, right, even me with ADD and Tourette's, right, all of these things stem from very, very deep childhood traumas in your past. And if you do not attend to those, you can try and hammer a person. So for example, we're going to look at ADD. We're going to look at the stuff now. I'm going to get into the articles and in the information, all that kind of stuff. Take someone like me with attention deficit disorder. Attention deficit disorder is actually, it's almost like a personality disorder. I actually have subclinical traits of other personality disorders, such as psychopathy and all of these kinds of things, where you can be unfeeling and uncaring. But that's me. Other people with ADD might have subclinical traits of others. So I might have a subclinical trait of, let's say, antisocial personality disorder, whilst another person with ADD as well, because their personality or their experience was slightly different, they might, whilst I shut down the emotions, they might be hypersensitive in their emotionality, and they may have subclinical traits instead of antisocial. They might have a subclinical trait of borderline or histrionic personality disorder, or things that are, and then these how can you say, these disordered ways of behaving then interfere with our normal functioning in life. And as a Christian, when we talk about normal functioning in life, we understand that means that there is a God, there is a way that God intended us to live, right? A fully functional way, a blueprint, if you will, of a way that God intended us to live. And there's something within us that prevents us from being able to live in that way, in such a manner that is healthy, and because it is our belief and our understanding that God desires what's best for us. And so, and what happens is, a lot of the time, is that the people, when you behave in a certain way, right, people come down on the behavior, which is, and this is where it's difficult, because the behavior is wrong, yes, okay, but at the same time, you are not going to, let's say someone who's addicted to drugs, you are not going to solve their problem by throwing them in prison. It's not going to happen. It's not going to help, right? Throwing people in prison for drug abuse is going to do nothing. It's going to do absolutely nothing. Criminalizing drug abuse doesn't help people, right? Because the reason why they're abusing drugs and why they're ruining their lives in that way is because they have a past in their childhood that completely messed them up, and now they have addictive problems with addiction, problems with impulse control later on in life, and these things are multi-generational, right? We need to understand the concept of multi-generational abuse, and the Bible talks about multi-generational abuse. If your grandparents were abused, that will cause disorders and problems in them, and they will then pass those disorders on to then your parents. Your parents will pass it on to you, and you will pass it on to your children. And at some point, even though it's all completely unfair, it's not fair that my parents were abused and that they ended up in the way that they were, not being particularly ideal in whatever ways that they were, right? It is not fair that as a result, I became the way that I am with attention deficit disorder and all that sort of thing. If you look at attention deficit disorder, you can see that there are structures in the brain, specifically the right prefrontal cortex, that are not developed properly, because these are issues of development. It's basically trauma and abuse and stuff like that is suffered between the ages of pre-birth, right, while you are still in the womb, all the way up to 4 years old. Between that time period, when you are in your development, your greatest developmental phase, that if you are traumatized in that sense, messes you up. It's not fair that happens, but at some point, one of us in the generation has to say, I'm gonna stop this. I have to stop the cycle of violence. I have to stop the cycle of abuse. I have to stop the cycle of trauma so that I don't keep with this, so it stops going on generation after generation. One of us has to take risk. It's not fair, but we have to take responsibility. We have to say, this is what I'm like. Fair or not fair, it becomes irrelevant, because at the end of the day, the aim is I want to live a normal and happy life, and B, if I want to raise healthy children, and if I don't want to screw them up, I need to make sure that I correct myself before I pass these issues on. Now, let me define trauma, okay? We need to understand what trauma means. Trauma, it's actually a very, very broad definition. Trauma can be almost anything. Why? Because you have a traumatic event, right? You have a traumatic event, so there's a stimulus, a traumatic stimulus, but the trauma happens internally. It happens inside you. It's an internal experience to that stimulus, which is why no two people will be traumatized in the same way, because everyone is different. So even though the trauma might be the same, you can have 5 different people, and each different person will develop a different disorder, because that disorder happens inside. It actually has less to do with the external stimulus and more to do with the internal workings of the individual human being. So, for example, if we look at my family, right? We as children, there's 3 of us, we experienced trauma as children, right? I turned out with attention deficit disorder and Tourette's disorder, right? With the twitching in the eyes and stuff like that. And then I have other subclinical. Now that I've discovered these things in my adult life, and I've tried to change my life, and I've been reading about these things, I've discovered that I have subclinical traits from other personality disorders, such as antisocial personality disorder and things like that, where I struggle, where because of the trauma, in order to protect myself as a child, I shut down the emotions, and so I don't feel. Right? And you find this is very common with the psychopathy, with narcissistic personality disorder, where as a defense mechanism, the emotions shut down and they lose the ability to empathize. Not actually to empathize, but there's actually more empathy there, as because they can read other people very well and understand what people are thinking. So that empath is there, but the emotional connection, right? The sympathy, the compassion is gone. Right? So the empathy is there because, in a sense, we like, for example, someone with narcissistic personality disorder is very, very good at reading other people, reading what they're feeling, whatever the case might be, and understanding that person even better than they know themselves. And that's actually a trait which an empath has. The difference is an empath has compassion, can sympathize, has empathy and stuff like that. Whereas with people with narcissistic personality disorder, psychopathy, antisocial and stuff like that, we don't have we don't have the compassion, we don't have the sympathy. It's not there. The emotional connection is not there. We're emotionally suppressed. And a lot of people want to get upset and say, well, this is terrible and all these kinds of things. But we need to understand that people, we never choose to be this way. We are made this way. And all the personality disorders, we need to understand that all the personality disorders develop as a coping mechanism to stress and trauma in our childhood, right? And whilst it might have served us well as children to survive in a stressful situation in childhood, late in adulthood, that adaptational behavioral framework is then obviously becomes a disorder once we go out into the world, because the world is different from the traumatic situation in our childhood. So trauma So understanding trauma, there's a stimulus, and then the trauma itself is an inner thing, an internal thing, and is peculiar to the individual. Which is why a lot of people will be like I was talking about myself, trauma as children. I developed ADD, certain personality disorders and stuff like that, and Tourette's, whereas my brother had a completely different set of issues, and my sister had a completely different set of issues, because all three of us were completely different, right? And also, a lot of people don't realize that your parents, a lot of people make the mistake in thinking that it's the same parent that parents all three children. That is not true. So, for example, if I look at my background, right? When I was born, my parents were not very wealthy at all, at all. Okay, they were still living in Brazil, and they were not well off at all, poor, and all that sort of stuff. And then they immigrated to South Africa, where they didn't speak the language at all. There was during the apartheid era, so there was so there was a lot of stresses and a lot of problems, a lot of issues there in that particular circumstance that was not there during the period when my brother and sister were born, right? So I got a different set of parents, because because the parents will have specific stresses, specific issues in that particular. So I would get a different set of parents than my brother and sister would have later on. And then there were issues for example, when apartheid ended, and Nelson Mandela was released from prison and all these kinds of things. There was a lot of fear that the black population was going to go totally crazy and just kill everyone that was white without discriminating. So they wouldn't care. They didn't care whether you were Brazilian or whether you were Portuguese or whether you were the actual oppressor, the Afrikaner or any. They were going to kill you. So then my parents, out of fear, fled to Portugal, and then we bounced between Portugal and Brazil. And so that was, my brother and sister were then very young, so that was a completely different situation, right? There was a period of time where my father wasn't around, because my father was traveling to other countries. He went to the US and stuff to sort of look for work, to try and make a life elsewhere, whilst we were in Portugal. And so for a whole year we didn't go to school. Parents couldn't afford school, all these kinds of things. We didn't go to school, and our father wasn't around for a whole year. He wasn't around. And so these things really influence and traumatize. So a lot of these things were not the parents' fault, but on top of that, my parents also then have certain, from their own traumatized upbringing, right? Because for example, my father, he lost his mother at a very young age, and he was living in Angola when the Civil War broke out, and he had to flee. That's why my father went to Brazil. He had to flee the Civil War there when he was a child. My mother had very abusive parents, lots of poverty and all these kinds of things. So all of these things, you can understand how it's a multi-generational thing, right? And it's very difficult, because we want to be angry with people, we want to hate people and all these kinds of things, but there has to be it's very difficult to figure out, and I struggle with this. At what point can I hold the person accountable for what they're doing, and at what point can I not hold the person accountable for what they're doing? Because this is part of the trauma, and sometimes when you're dealing with the individual, you're not actually dealing with the individual, you are dealing with the disorder that almost takes over, almost like possesses you, and you can see you're not really dealing with the person. It's very difficult. Now, to further understand trauma is basically one of two things. The first thing is, trauma is anything that shouldn't happen but does happen. Okay? This can be sexual abuse, it can be verbal abuse, it can be physical abuse, deprivation of some purposeful manipulation or things like that, threatening, violence, all that kind of stuff. Things that shouldn't happen but do happen. Also, the second thing, Trauma can also be things that should happen but do not happen. So, for example, if your parents are not loving, if your parents are not attentive, if your parents are not emotionally salient, if your parents didn't bond with you properly as a child, um, if your parents were stressed and couldn't pay attention to you, if your parents were impoverished and both of them had to work, and therefore they, by necessity, they had to leave you at daycare or with a nanny or something like that, so that your primary attachment constantly gets severed, and then as a child, the child develops abandonment issues, and that develops an issue. So something that should happen. So your parents should have been there, they should have been around, you should have attached to a primary, you should have had your primary attachment around, which is usually the mother. But a lot of times, because either the mother doesn't give a damn, right? So that's something that shouldn't happen but does happen. Your mother doesn't give a damn. She goes off. She was shopping with her friends and then hires a babysitter because she couldn't care, or leaves you in front of the television. So neglectful mothers and fathers, or it can be out of your mother really loves you, she really cares for you, but because of necessity, maybe she's a single mother, whatever the case might be, she can't be around because she's got to work to provide and all these kinds of things. And all of these things contribute to who you become later on in life and how you cope. Because as a child, you need to understand, as a child, you don't understand any of these things, right? All as a child. So if you think about a little duckling that hatches from its egg, little duckling hatches from its egg, the first thing it sees, mother duck. There's biological systems where it must attach to mother duck. This is my primary caregiver, and I need to attach to that, and this is going to be my source of comfort, etc., etc. All of the developmental things. And what people don't understand is that development in humans continues after. We gestate outside of the womb, not only before the womb. So, for example, the studies have come out, and they've discovered that a mother who is pregnant, who is highly stressed, will find that in the placenta, in the child, there are highly elevated levels of cortisol and all of these kinds of things, which will affect the brain development. Because you need to understand, human beings, our primary feature is that we are cerebral creatures. Our primary issue is brain development, and that will affect the brain development of the mother already in the womb. It's not just about, did the mother smoke? Did the mother drink? Did she eat healthily? Did she exercise? It's not just about that. It's also, was she stressed? Was she in a safe situation when she was pregnant with you? Was she in a stable situation? Was she in a loving situation? Did she have a loving husband, or was the husband abusive? All of these kinds of things will factor in to what happens to the baby before the baby is born. And then once the baby is born, because we need to understand, we continue to develop. Our frontal cortex, our prefrontal cortexes, are not fully developed until about the age of 30. Human beings have a very, very long period of development before we reach full maturity. We do not reach full maturity until we're 30 years old. All right, which is why in the Bible, for those of you who are Christian, in the Bible, Jesus did not start his ministry until he was 30 years old. Priesthoods, things like that, people couldn't start in official duties in priesthoods and all these kinds of things. They could not start. These things were not allowed to happen until they were 30 years old. Why? Because were not fully mature until you were 30 years old. Which is why when the Bible uses the terminology child, a child can be a person between the ages of 0 and 30. All right, which is where a lot of confusion in the Hebrew mind. A person in their 20s was still considered a child. You were not fully adult until you were 30 years old. All right, and that's why you see the number 30 in terms of age become a very prominent feature in the Bible for when certain people start certain types of things. And the prime example is Jesus started his ministry at the age of 30 years old. So these are very, very important issues. Now, another problem is people, if you is the understanding, the world understanding of the human development. If we take a person with a personality disorder or whatever the case might be, say, for example, depression or ADD or whatever the case might be, and you go and you do an EEG or and you do all those kinds of brain scans, you will find that there is actually brain damage there. So, for example, with ADHD, there is underdevelopment of the right hemisphere of a prefrontal cortex. We have insufficient dopamine production, right? Which is why we struggle to get motivated to do things, right? Because dopamine is the incentive rewards circuitry within the system that picks you up and moves you towards a goal. For people with ADD and ADHD and stuff like that, it's too low. It's not functioning, which is why when we get medicated, we use stimulants like Ritalin and stuff like that, because that kicks the dopamine and stuff like that. And it is why that's why people with ADD can struggle with impulse control, where they will fixate with they can become addicted to things which stimulate dopamine kicks, extreme sport. You'll find a lot of people who go to extreme sports. A lot of those people have ADD. We do very, very well in those kinds of things because it takes, in order to excite us, it takes huge amount of stimulation. Otherwise, nothing, nothing. Okay. And now here's the thing, right? People think that the ADD, that the brain damage causes the ADD, right? The brain damage causes the ADD, or is it the ADD that causes the brain damage? Which one is it? And what they're discovering, that what's actually going on is that during that period of 9 months in the womb and up to 4 years of age, your brain every day is producing about 1 billion new neurons, and is also eliminating about another 1 billion of neurons, right? So it's constantly building new circuits and replacing and eliminating circuits. There's very, very dynamic, the brain development. And what happens is, which circuits will develop and which ones do not develop depend on the environment. Okay? Will depend on the environment. The brain, the development will assess what's going on in the environment, and from there will determine which circuits develop and which do not. And so for people with ADD, or people with depression, people with all of these kinds of disorders, personality disorders and stuff like that, in every single one of these people, what you are actually witnessing is someone whose brain, whose emotional centers, whose compulsion center, whose brain in general was developed according to a traumatic situation. For example, almost like a soldier that goes to war and develops post-traumatic stress disorder, right? That situation has conditioned them in a certain way, so that now when they come back into normal civilian life, they can't function because they've been conditioned by a different environment. And it's the same thing, right? And it's the same thing with homosexuality. I know a lot of people don't want to admit that homosexuality is in fact a disorder, but it is. I have never in my life ever met someone who was gay who did not have problems in the family. It doesn't exist. I've never met such a person, right? And what do I mean by problems in the family? Because when people say problems in the family, the first thing their minds always go to is, oh, was it abuse? Well, I was never sexually abused. I was never physically abused. My family was very loving, and that's sort of a mystery. But the thing is, those are not the only things that cause trauma, right? Was your father emotionally salient? Did your father accept you? Did you feel, did in your entire life when you were growing up, did you ever feel like your father actually accepted you and actually loved you? Did you ever feel like your mother actually loved you? Were they there for you? Were they maybe too busy and preoccupied at work? Right? Were they preoccupied with everything but you? There's many, many different ways. And then a lot of homosexual people will say, well, if it's the environment, then why is it that I became gay, but my brother or my sister didn't? It's because you're different people, right? You know, you might have developed the homosexual tendency because there was no the bond between you and your father was not there, right? So all of these disorders are doing one of two things. All disorders, basically, I'm being very, very basic, I'm being very general. All disorders are doing one of two things, basically. One, they serve as a protective mechanism. It's a defense mechanism, right? Two, it serves as a mechanism to get what your parents didn't give you when you were a child, right? So take someone with a histrionic personality disorder, most common in women, right? Women with histrionic personality disorder are highly attention-seeking, highly sexually inappropriate. So what are they doing? Right? What are they doing? They're trying to get attention. They're trying to get approval. They're trying to look for that attachment, right? Sexual attachment, whatever the case might be, because they didn't get it from either their father or their mother when they were young. A lot of women, right, who sleep around a lot and find that they can't seem to control it, right? Why? If you talk to them, you'll find it's because they weren't accepted by their fathers. They didn't feel connected to their fathers. So that sleeping around is them trying to look for that connection in men, what they were missing when as fathers. And it's the same thing with homosexuality. They're looking for that connection they're looking for that connection with the masculine that they didn't get, that they not only couldn't get within themselves, but they could not get from their fathers because the father wasn't there. And so that there was that disconnect from not only the external primary masculine figure in the family. So usually what happens with homosexuality is you have a father who is not emotionally salient. The father is not there. The primary masculine figure in your family rejects you in some way, right? Completely rejects you and doesn't affirm that, and as a result doesn't affirm the masculine within you. And then to further aggravate the situation, usually there's an overbearing mother. So the homosexual individual's personality becomes subsumed by an overbearing, codependent mother that devours them, right? And so there is a situation that I know where there's two brothers. The one brother turned out to be homosexual, and the other brother wasn't homosexual, but he had other disorders. So he had oppositional defiant disorder, he had a problem with authority, and all of these kinds of things. And if you look at their personalities, you will see that the one brother is a lot more gentle than the other. So if you did the personality tests, and the one brother was a lot less dominant than the other. So the one brother, the one who developed sort of subclinical antisocial traits, oppositional defiant disorder, he had ADD as well. He had, if you looked at his extroversion, a subset of assertiveness. His assertiveness was sky high. And so he never, because he was so assertive, he always banged heads with his mother, and she couldn't devour him. He refused to let her. He was too assertive. But the other brother, who was a lot more gentle, had much lower assertiveness, much lower assertiveness and higher neuroticism, so was easily made afraid, and also higher agreeableness, so required the higher you are in agreeable, the more conflict averse you are. You want to be friends with people. So it was very easy for then the devouring mother to devour him. So the mother approved of the one child because she could consume him, but rejected the other child because the child opposed her, because he had a high dominance. And then the one brother, and so then the gay brother was bullied at school, not because he was gay, but because he couldn't stand up for himself. You generally find that case. So most people who are homosexual find that they were bullied in school and all these kinds of things. But if being bullied makes you gay, then why is it that not all people that are bullied are gay? You understand what I'm saying? So it's because the children who are bullied tend to be children who are very, very low in are low in extroversion, low in assertiveness. They can't stand up for themselves, and because they have an unstable family at home, they were never socialized. They were never given the opportunity to develop the proper social skills necessary in order to be successful in the social world. Whereas the other brother was socially very successful, but not so much because he had necessarily good social skills, but because he was so domineering that people just wanted to be his. Everyone wants to be friends with the alpha male, as it were, and so that's the family dynamic there. And so the mother was devouring of the one, was rejecting of the other one, and then the father, who was not emotionally salient at all, had his own issues. He then rejected the softer one, the gentler one, because that was against his personality. He thought him to be whiny and a bit whatever, and actually mistreated him in a lot of ways, but was more accepting of the more assertive son, and which then affirmed the masculinity trait in that one. And so you see how that family dynamic plays out, why you've got two sons growing up in the same family, but experiencing two completely different types of parents, two completely different life experiences, two completely different personalities. One developed one. So the brother who was then was a lot who developed homosexuality, developed depression, developed drug abuse problems, or went into drugs, a lot of drugs, became a stripper at one point. A lot of the issues, and you see these issues a lot in homosexual men. Drug abuse, suicide, and things are very, 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 very common. And now the LGBT communities, and this is why I hate the activists, right? The activism, because the activism says that the reason these people are like that is because they're rejected, is because society rejects them. That is false. The reason these people are like that is because their parents rejected them. It's because their parents rejected them. It's not because society rejects them. Society rejects them because because their parents rejected them. They developed disorders. They go out into the world with the disorders, and the society rejects them because of the disorders, because they are disordered in their ways with dealing with each other. And so it's the same thing then with the brother who didn't become gay. Society rejected him as well. He lost jobs. He couldn't hold down a job because he was too oppositional. He was too defiant. He had a problem with authority. He became criminal, right? He became criminal, and society would rightly reject that criminality and all these kinds of things. So the LGBT activists have got it completely wrong. It's not because society rejects these people. It's because these people have been rejected first by their parents in some way. There was trauma in the family in some way, and it's trauma that causes homosexuality, and it's trauma that causes alcohol abuse. It's trauma that causes a person who's promiscuous. It's trauma that causes someone who is aggressive and violent. All of these things that we call sin, right? Which is this legacy of sin. This is where the Christian understanding comes in, which is why Jesus was so compassionate and went and around and healed people and spent time with people and didn't condemn anyone, right? And all these kinds of things. Why? Because he understood, yes, that these things were sinful. Yes, the concept of sin, and this is why, and this is now where the problem comes in. The concept of sin was never designed to be a stick that you beat people over the head with, right? It was designed for us to understand the human nature, the cycle of violence that we go through from our parents, us, pass it on to our children, our children's children, and so on and so forth. It's to understand that what the human condition has become. And then it's an admonition for us to, no matter how unfair it is, we need to do these things. So now when we get to the thing, Christians have been completely ignorant. When a Christian says pray away the gay, you need to understand, if you are homosexual, because a lot of people say, oh, why do Christians make such a big deal out about homosexuality? Right? In a way they don't. In a way they don't, because unlike the homosexual movement, there is, so for example, there is no such thing as a alcoholics acceptance movement or alcoholics rights movement. All right, there's no such thing as a narcissist rights movement or a and these kinds of things, right? You don't get those things. We rightfully recognize that these things are disordered ways of being that affect, that get in the way of your normal operation, sort of thing. And that is what it is. Homosexuality, we're a bigendered species, right? We are physically, biologically designed to be binary. That's just, it is. And so if something doesn't congrue with that natural way of being, well, then something's gone wrong. It's gone disordered. And let me tell you something, right? A lot of people, the Christians, they want to come down. Oh, you gay people, you are that. No, you shouldn't do that. Don't do that. What you should do is try to help such an individual, whether gay or lesbian or whatever it is. Say, listen, you don't know what you're missing out on by having, as a man, if I think about my own experience, as a man, and I had personality problems and stuff like that sort of thing, as a man uniting with a woman to become whole, that took me in a very, very profound way from being completely messed up, right, to becoming whole again, to all the stuff that I didn't get when I was a child and all these kinds. And not that we're supposed to use relationships as a crutch, right? Your relationship is not supposed to be therapy, but that's almost that second chance in life, because my wife, as a woman, has got things that I don't have. She had the compassion which I lacked, which I didn't have, and she taught me how to be more compassionate. She taught me how to be things that I was not, and vice versa, because she also had a lot. I could then teach her to be things that she didn't have, because I'm very assertive, because I also had oppositional, defiant, and all that. I could teach her how to stand up for herself, how to have like self-worth, and to stand up for herself and ask for what she wants and stuff like that. And it's a healing relationship to have. You don't get that if you marry a mirror image to you. You don't get that. It's impossible. So let's get stuck into the internet sources here. Now, here's something that a lot of people use an excuse. Here, this is the Apostle Paul. He says the following: "Lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness," and so on and so forth. Okay. So Paul, what's happening here is Paul had some kind of physical affliction that he asked God. He said, "Listen, God, can you please take this away from me?" And God said, "No." He said, "Brother, you're going to have to live with that." And Paul understood that whatever struggle he had to go through because of this thing was actually for his own good. It was to develop his character, right? So God doesn't magically take something away. Why? Because there is a characterological development that needs to go on. You need to, the whole Christian point is the development of character so that you can then be characterologically fit to go to heaven. When you die, you take one thing with you and one thing alone when you go to heaven, and that is your character. You get a new body, everything is renewed, but you take your character with you. And let that be a very, very profound thought in your mind. You take who you are, you will take with you. Right? It's not like the pagan religions where you become one with the universe and your individuality is dissolved. No. Right? You will get a new body, you'll get all these kinds of things, but when we go to heaven, who you are, you will take with you. And your character development happens now. Okay? So a lot of people use this passage in one of two ways. The first way is they say, well, then my disorder is something that was given by God, and it's, you understand? So you see where I'm going with this? So they reject the need to have to get over, to remedy the problem, because it's a gift from God. And you see this from people all the time. People saying, people pretending that autism is some sort of superpower. People pretending that ADHD is some sort of superpower. It's asinine. All right? I know someone very close to me that's got Asperger's. I've got ADD. I've got Tourette's. I've got some of these disorders. I know people with these disorders. To say that these are superpowers is asinine. Right? It's hell to live with these things. Okay? And you get people all over the place because they want to, I don't know, because they want to stroke their ego. I don't know what, I honestly am not entirely certain. I have my theories, but I'm not 100% certain why people do that. Or autism is like a superpower. No, it's hell. Okay? It's hell. I know people that have got autism. It's not pleasant. It's hell. All right, and the problem with that is then people identify with these things, right? Like there are some people who, like, oh well, if you could make a wish and have your autism go away, would you wish for it? And they're like, no, why should I have to change for the world to accept me? It's idiotic. Why are you identifying with your disorder? You are not your disorder, and that's the problem. That's what prevents a lot of people from then changing, because if they say to me, Morgan, this way and that way of being is incorrect, and I could stand up, well, why should I have to be more compassionate, and why should I change for the world to accept me? Because I am not my disorders. Okay? I have ADHD, I am not ADHD. Right? Someone with autism has autism, they are not autism. Someone that is gay they are an individual with a sexual orientation. They are not gay. You yourself, a person, are not gay, just like with heterosexuality. We don't identify ourselves, and you see this in the world. You don't see heterosexuals identifying with their heterosexuality in the same way that homosexuals and transgenders and all this kind of stuff identify with their issues. It's not an identity. It's just a thing that you happen to be. It's not an identity. It's not part of your character. It's not who you are. And those things can change, and you can still be the same person, right? If my ADD vanishes tomorrow, I'm still the same individual, right? If someone with Asperger's or autism if that vanishes tomorrow, it's still the same person. The only difference is now they just don't have the roadblocks anymore, right? And so here's another thing to think about. Sorry, this is my ADD, I'm jumping around, but just quickly. The disorders separate you from your body. Right? So, for example, people with ADD, if you've ever known anyone with ADD, when you lose that focus and you sort of fixate on something or somewhere else, right? Your mind goes somewhere else. What you're actually doing is you are dissociating. I only discovered this recently. What you're doing is you're dissociating, right? And the reason you are dissociating is because whatever trauma was happening when you were a child, as a child, whenever you confront a dangerous situation or a painful situation, you've got one of three options. You can either run away, or you can fight back, or if you can't do one of those two, you can dissociate. You can remove yourself mentally from the situation, right? Those are your only options. Now, as a child, you can't fight back and you can't run away. So what's your only option? You dissociate. You remove yourself from your body. People that go through, rape victims do the same thing. A lot of these personality disorders are in many ways disorders of dissociation, right? So for example, if you think about narcissistic personality disorder, the persona that the narcissist portrays is false. They are not. There's like an inner undeveloped child, but that the personality is not real. It's a dissociation. It's a defense mechanism. It's like if the world is going to attack something, they will attack the hologram that is of personality, that is me, the grandiose whatever it is. They will attack that, but they won't attack me. There's a dissociation there. It's the same thing with the multiple personality disorder. It's a dissociation. It's the same thing with the transgender issue. Whatever trauma that's happened has caused the individual to dissociate from their body. All of these things are dissociative disorders, right? What we call gender dysphoria and something like that. Some kind of trauma has happened that has caused you as an individual to detach your mind from your body, right? Now, when we think holistically, right? When we think holistic, and now even the Eastern religions have picked up on this, that you are mind, body, and soul. And Christianity is actually very similar along those lines. Your body and your mind and your soul, all of these things are one package. All right? Your body is a part of you. Okay? It's a part of you. When we go to heaven, right? Christianity is the only religion in the world that says when you go to heaven, you are going to be given a new body. You're going to there's a resurrection. Right? Christianity has a resurrection. You are resurrected. It's not in other religions. You leave your body is just the vessel. Your spirit leaves your body, floats off into wherever, and you have a dissociation. Okay, paganism is dissociative, right? You dissociate your spirit or your character from your body. Christianity says no. There's nothing wrong with the body. The body and the mind and the soul and everything go together in one package. And our final analysis is we are resurrected. We will be resurrected and we will go to heaven for the certain period of time, and then when the time is over, we will come back to this earth. The earth will be renewed, and we will spend eternity as physical beings with bodies. All right? So whilst paganism is dissociative, right, Christianity is associative. It connects the mind and the body back together and understands that there's conflicts, right? The spirit, the battle between the spirit and the flesh, right? And the point is not to dissociate yourself from the flesh. It is to gain mastery over the flesh. My body becomes subject to my will. Whatever impulses I have, I am in control, right? So the world says, whatever impulse you have, go and fulfill it. If you have an impulse for sex, if you have an impulse for drugs, if you have an impulse for, just fulfill it. Christianity says no. It says the body, even though the mind and the body are connected and unite, right? The body must never have the control. The mind must have the control. It's the mind controls the body, and everything becomes holistic, and you become a unit. You bring the body into, because what the body wants is often harmful to itself, right? Drugs are harmful. Sex is harmful. So wanton sex is harmful. Sex only within a very limited scope is actually beneficial. It is otherwise harmful, right? And the world has, and if you look at the world is completely dissociated. The world does one of two things, right? It either says dissociate your mind and listen only to your body. So go sex, drugs, rock and roll, go and do whatever your body wants, right? The world is dissociative. Do whatever your body wants, or dissociates the mind from the body, and then the person becomes like a hermit, right? So you get a lot of these Eastern religions, these pagan religions and stuff like that, where they say, well, the body is just this vessel that we will discard, and we're going to detach the mind. So, for example, if you think about Buddhism says that this is all an illusion, right? It's dissociating the mind from the body. Okay? Christianity says no. together, both of them together as a whole, and the mind and you need to get a symbiosis going on, right? Between the mind and the body, between the human being and nature, and all these kinds of things, it must all gel and work together. And so when you see disorders in the world, if you look at the personality disorders, all of the personality disorders are disorders where either the person dissociates the mind, so they leave the mind behind and they only listen to their impulses, which is why there's when we talk about impulse control is you just listening to the body. The body says go and do that because you'll feel better, and they just go and do that. Or you have problems of a dissociation between, so for example, transgenderism is a dissociation between the mind and the body, where the person rejects the body. And it's basically under the class of dysphorias, where a person might accept the body but reject, let's say, an arm, and they believe, well, I shouldn't have an arm, and then they want to amputate their arms because they believe that they shouldn't have an arm. So they've become dysphoric, they've rejected the arm, or they've rejected the eyes. There was a woman in an article a while back where she was talking about how she purposefully blinded herself. I think she threw acid in her eyes and stuff because she believed that she was actually blind, a blind person. So there was a dissociation between her and her vision. And that's the problem. When Christians look at these issues, we need to understand that somewhere along the line there was trauma, and that trauma caused us to disassociate in one of two ways. We either dissociate into our bodies, or we dissociate into our minds. And there was a break. There was a break in the human organism somewhere, and that's really where the problem is. And so, when you are going to address the therapy, right? So Paul here says, God let me have, he didn't just magically take away this thing that was afflicting me. Why? Because there's something I had to learn and had to develop my character. And some people will be like, oh, well, I'll just be gay because then my gayness has something to, no. Or because I could say that about my aggression. Oh, my aggression is something that I contribute to society. No, aggression is wrong. Right? And being antisocial is wrong. Whatever is wrong with me is wrong. I have no business saying that this is somehow a gift from God, right? But why doesn't God immediately just take it away? It says because there is an overcoming to do. It's part of your process in life is to overcome things, right? That's how you build character. You build character not by indulging. You build character by overcoming. In every single way under the sun, you can only build character by overcoming things. And that is why if God just took away all afflictions, just like this, all the problems gone, our characters wouldn't develop, right? Because your character develops like your muscle develops. It develops with resistance, right? Develops with resistance. It's with hard work and stuff like that. And it is God's intention. God thinks about the future. He's less concerned about, he's concerned about now, but God's ultimate purpose is to get you into heaven, right? And to get you into heaven, you need to develop your character in a certain way. So when we sit back and we say, well, we must pray away the gay, or we must pray away the depression, or we must pray away the narcissistic personality disorder, or we must pray away this or pray away that. Not true. Not true. We must, when we pray, we're asking for the wrong thing. First of all, God is not a slot machine that you can just pray, oh, please take this problem away. He's a genie. God is not a genie, okay? We must pray for the strength, for the insight to see and identify what's wrong and why it's wrong, and pray for the strength to overcome it. Because let me tell you, I've done the process, or for the rest of my life, I will probably be going through it. The process of overcoming the issues in my life. I cannot even begin to tell you how difficult it is. The physical pain that you sometimes endure, because the psychological can manifest physically. The physical pain that you can sometimes endure when you're having to overcome some of these issues is ridiculous. And I've seen people. So I did a video on multiple personality disorder. I've seen what happens when personalities integrate. The sheer difficulty. It's unbelievable, but we're better for it. We're better for it. So when we say when Christians say these stupid things, like just pray about it, what are they actually saying? They're saying, A, I'm ignorant. That's what they're saying. B, I can't be bothered to understand what's going on. And therefore, I prefer to act with prejudice against this individual and simply accuse them of not praying hard enough. What's actually required for us to overcome any of these things, whether it's homosexuality, whether it's aggression, whether it's alcohol, whether it's depression, whatever it is, if you do not get to the root source of the problem, right? Because these things manifest in behaviors, it requires getting to know yourself, why you're like that, what was your past, what was your, all of these kinds of things. Getting that therapy done. That's, oh, pardon me, that's hard work. That's hard work. It's about being sensitive. It's about being compassionate. It's about being all of these kinds of things, right? Not about going off half-cocked like these social justice warriors, right? Because the social justice warriors are broken. They're detached. They're saying one of two things: we must either follow completely what the emotions tell us, the mind, or what the body tells us. So that's why in the you see this dissociation in the social justice warrior movement, where they're saying you're not allowed to slut shame. So slut shaming, the whole slut, sleep around, promiscuity, take drugs and stuff, is the dissociation in where you are only a body. And then the transgender issue is then another dissociation where you are only a mind, right? Where the body is getting in the way of something, right? Rather than unifying the two, right? That's all you see in the social justice warrior movement. And it doesn't mean that there aren't people. And here's the interesting thing, right? When you look at both the political left and the political right, you see that each one has disorders specific to them. So, for example, if you look at the social justice movement, right, the social justice war, the left, for the most part, you will find an overrepresentation of histrionic personality disorder, which is sexually inappropriate, attention-seeking, irrationality. So it's a histrionic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, dysphoria, all of these kinds of things, right? Whereas if you look on the other side, on the political right, what you'll then usually find, because they tend to be the very successful in business and all these kinds of things, and there's overlap. Believe me, the left and the right are more alike than you would think, right? Which is why the dialectic between the two is so idiotic, right? But again, if we're going to sort of generalize on the other side, because what do the social justice, what do the left typically accuse the right of being? Accuse them of being insensitive, lacking compassion, And what's that typical of? It's typical of narcissism. It's typical of antisocial. It's typical of psychopathy and all that kind of stuff. And as we've found, one of the things that are highly predictive of business, of corporate success, are actually personality traits that are in line with narcissism, interestingly enough. So low agreeableness, high extroversion, high assertiveness, so which is a high dominance thing, and low neuroticism, right? Which are things that are typical not only of a very, very successful businessman, but also very, very typical of someone with grandiose narcissism, right? So these things are very, very interesting, and how they all play out if you look at the world through a psychological lens and see how these things are playing out. And so this is the verse sort of thing. So a lot of people misuse this as an excuse to keep on being who they are, rather than saying, so here it says, my grace is sufficient for thee, my strength is made perfect in weakness. So God will help you overcome. Okay, now here it talks about the intergenerational, right? Kings. So the Bible talks about multi-generational sins, right? It says here, and he walked in the sins of his father, which he had done before him, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord, as the heart of David his father. So into multi-generational, right? One of the reasons why we see most of the kings of Israel were evil is because You'd only need one evil king to influence his children for evil. So, for example, when King David went and killed one of his subjects off in order to get his wife, and then God said, listen, your children are going to do X and Y and Z. What God was identifying there, it wasn't so much God cursing him by some divine fear. Well, now you are cursed and I'm going to make these things happen. He's saying, as a consequence, what God is identifying is that there was a personality trait flaw. There was a disorder there in King David, that he was willing to do that, right? And God is saying, because you have not mastered that flaw in yourself, you are going to pass that on to your children, and it's going to manifest itself in your children. And we know that King David's children caused nothing but problems after him. They did horrendous things, right? It's all the intergenerational thing. Here we go. Isaiah, prepare for slaughter for his children, for the iniquity of their fathers, that they do not rise, nor possess the land, nor fill the face of the world with cities. Right? So in this situation as well, it's talking about a lot of people. What you need to understand, when the Bible is talking about the sins of the fathers, it's not saying that the children are being punished for what their fathers did, right? The children are being punished for what they're doing, but what they're doing happens to be the same thing that their fathers did, because they learned it from their fathers. So, for example, when you look at like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, or when the Israelites went into Canaan and destroyed certain cities of Canaan, God had allowed several hundred years. So, for example, with the Canaanites, God had given 400 years for the Canaanites to repent and to change their way of being, to break the cycle of violence, the intergenerational cycle of violence within the people, within their communities, so that they would stop that cycle of violence, multi-generational, continuing going on. And only once they demonstrated that there was completely, it was like a hopeless case, did God eventually then say, right, here, the Israelites, I'm giving you the Canaan, not because you're better, but because Canaan has got to the point where they've proven beyond, I've given them a chance, they've proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, they are not willing to break this multi-generational cycle of violence, cycle of disorder, cycle of perversion and problems and stuff like that. And so it's now time for me to execute judgment on them and wipe them out, because if I leave them to continue, this is why in the end times Christ is going to he's going to take away the saved, but those who are not saved, he's going to obliterate them. Why? It's not because he's being ridiculous and arbitrary. It's because if he had to allow the wicked to continue, they would just continue the cycle of violence forever. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I gotta go. Right, I'm back, ladies and gentlemen. You heard that bell just now, and that was the gas company. They've come to set up change meters. This is new smart meter business. Anyway, so I ended off talking about the verse that we discussed in Isaiah, and how the reason why God at the end of time eventually eliminates the wicked is because if he did not do so, we refer back, I said that the only thing you take with you into heaven, into the hereafter, and so on and so forth, is your character. And so therefore those at the end of time who are not saved is because they refuse to change their characters. And as a result, if God allowed them to continue on this earth or in heaven or whatever the case might be, their characters would be to continue the generational cycle of violence and cycle of sin and cycle of problems that we see today and that we've seen for many, many years. So if we go back now to the next verse up in Numbers, and it makes it quite clear here. It says, the Lord is long-suffering, great mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression. So this is what God prefers to do. But just because he's merciful and forgiving of iniquity and transgression, it doesn't mean that he then and says, and by no means clearing the guilty. So it's not like he allows, just because he's forgiving and stuff, doesn't mean he allows people to get away with nonsense either. It says, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. So again, we have a description here where God, even though he's merciful and all these kinds of things, he's not going to prevent, because he's given humans free will and autonomy over the civilizations and the communities that we create. Even though he's forgiving and stuff like that, he's not the type of person, he's not going to allow that he's not going to let us get away with it. So if we do things that are wrong, he's not going to remove the consequences of our wrongdoing from us, because then we never learn, do we? And so on and so forth. So and this is warning that the iniquity of the fathers gets passed down. It's a multi-generational thing, right? It's a multi-generational thing. And if we look at the history of so for example, if we look, let's look in recent years, for example. If you go to like the 2008 recession, for example, if you speak to psychologists and you look at the statistics and stuff like that, during that year there would have been an uptick, a significant uptick in people seeking psychological help, people seeking medication for depression, etc., 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 because it would have been a very, very stressed period of time to live in. And then if you take the children from those, whoever was children back then, and you monitor them, you will find that that high stressed zone will then have an effect. You will see that effect in the children later on in the develop. You will find that the characters and the personalities of the children will, whoever was young or even an infant during that time, that event will be stamped upon the personalities of the children, because it was a high stress time for the parents and things of that sort. And you might find that then, if the parents don't remedy that and don't try to get control of that in any way, or see the difficulty in the children, don't try to correct that with the appropriate means, they'll find that then the children themselves will then might develop certain issues later on. And so this is a huge multi-generational issue. So when we're talking about, so when if we go back to the original phrase, we say, where people say, pray away the gay, right? This is, for everything I explained, also explains why what do they call it? What's that therapy that they said? Conversion therapy. It's why conversion therapy won't work. All right, conversion therapy won't work. Shock therapy won't work. Ignoring it won't work, sort of thing. These kinds of modalities don't work, right? And the reason why they don't work is the same reason why every other thing that we try to do in order to prevent bad behavior in human beings, or undesirable, whatever the case might be, is because we focus on the behavior rather than on the relationship and the life situation which creates the behavior. We need to understand that when you feel pain, for example, the pain is a symptom of something else. Now, you can treat the pain, painkillers, drugs, alcohol, sex, right? So these behaviors that you find are attempting to treat the inner pain, but that doesn't resolve the root underlying issue. So if you can do till the cows come home, right? With a person who's gay or lesbian, whatever the case might be, and if you harp on the fact that they're gay or lesbian and mistreat them because they're gay or lesbian, whatever the case, you're not gonna improve them. You're just gonna make it worse. You're gonna drive them away, right? So, for example, one thing that to point out. So, for example, let's say you have somewhat abusive parents or neglectful parents, right? So such parents will then produce, let's say, oppositional disorder in the child. Now the child becomes a difficult child, becomes oppositional, confrontational, doesn't respect authority. So what the parents do is the parents cause the oppositional trait in the child behaves oppositional, and the parent's solution is then to do more of the same, which then makes the child do more of the same, become even more positional, and it forms a vicious cycle. And the thing is to break the cycle. How do you break the cycle? Is you've got to be highly attentive. You've got to reconnect with the child. You've got to show them that no matter what it is they're doing. And that's why a lot of Christians say, love the sinner but hate the sin. And that's actually true. Love the individual, accept the individual, because if you look at the social justice warriors, the LGBT movement and all that kind of stuff, they're constantly complaining about how they're rejected, how they're not loved by others, how they're ostracized, and da, 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 da. But if you look at every community, it's the same thing. If you look at people with disabilities, if you look at people with personality disorders, all of these people, they're all complaining about the same thing, that they're rejected, they're not loved, all these kinds of things, that they're outcasts and all that kind of. That's one of the biggest complaints of people in the world, is that they're outcasts. And they're struggling to find connection. Part of the whole identity crisis, which is why you see the identity politics out in the world, is this thing of trying to find where they belong, because that connection that they were supposed to have with their parents as children was broken, is not there, and so it results in feelings of insecurity, feelings of not knowing where they belong, not knowing who they are, because we get all of these things from our upbringing, from our parents. And so if you try to, let's say you see a child that's got a behavioral disorder, you're not going to fix the child by harping on his behavior. However, so how do you actually fix people? If you address the underlying root cause, the neglect, the lack of love, the lack of connection with human beings, the lack of feeling accepted, the lack of feeling nurtured and treasured, and all of these kinds of things. Now, I know these sound, for a lot of people, this sound might really corny, might sound a bunch of snowflakes, but the fact is a fact, right? And those who don't become snowflakes, right? You need to understand this. Those who do not become snowflakes become narcissists and murderers and stuff like that, right? So you've got one of two options. If you are, there's this trauma, and you'll get one of two people. You will get the oppressors and you'll get the oppressed. You will get the narcissists, the psychopaths, the whatever, and you'll get the borderlines, the histrionics, the snowflakes, and all that. Basically, to use the common parlance and stuff like that, you get the insensitive oppressors, and then you get the whiny snowflakes. Both of them are that way for the same reason. And if you harp on the behavior, you'll get nowhere. You have to come to a point where you address the underlying root issue. That was the childhood problems and stuff like that. And please be aware, right, that when we're talking about the childhood trauma can happen even if the parents can happen unknowingly. It's not always because the parent is a negligent psychopath, right, sort of thing. It's not always because of that. It's stress in the parents that is unavoidable. So sometimes it happens because of bad parenting, because the parents are bad, evil, miserable people who themselves have psychological disorders. But then sometimes it can just be from parents who fall on hard times, who, despite themselves, they still screw up their children without knowing, without intending to do so. And then one of the difficult things, and those type of parents are usually easier to fix the problem, because the parents then genuinely love their children, are willing to do what it takes in order to try and repair the relationships and repair the bonds. Whereas those parents who are malicious, let's say, they will never be willing to accept responsibility. And then you as an individual, you'll have to find your ways of healing and stuff like that in therapy that might actually not include your parents at all, and might even necessitate you having to break ties from your parents entirely. Because if the relationship there is really toxic and they're malicious people who are going to continuously wound and injure you, then you have to break those ties, because if that person's unwilling to change, you can't have that relationship. The relationship can't be mended. So these are very, very difficult subjects, and it is a fact of the matter, right? There's a lot of people out there who used to be gay or no longer gay. They've changed. I personally know people who used to be homosexual, lesbian, and are no longer. Not because, and every single one of them tell me, it's not because they someone converted them or treated the gayness. You can't you can't treat the gayness. It's because they went into therapy to address the issues of childhood development, and then without realizing it, they suddenly realize, oh, I'm not actually gay. Oh, I'm not actually lesbian. I was just trying to look for something that I didn't get in my childhood. And then they go on to live heterosexual lives. No problem. You see the same thing with transgenders. There are a lot of transgenders out there, and it's becoming increasingly more prevalent, where they're saying the operations don't work. There is one gentleman, two gentlemen I've got in mind, where they say they got the whole sex change, they did the whole shooting match. Within 8 years, they had detransition. There is a massive rate of detransitioning going on right now as we speak, but the media hides that, right? The LGBT activists hide that. But there's this detransitioning going on. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, BBC had an article, which is unusual, had an article the other day. I must actually dig it up, where they were reporting on people that are detransitioning, where they're realizing, I'm actually not a woman. And they're realizing that the transition actually didn't help me. If anything, it made it worse. And then you find that rates of suicide, depression, alcohol abuse, all of these things that you don't only find within the transsexual community, that you don't only find within the homosexual community, but that you find with people who suffer from ADHD, and people who suffer from borderline, and people who suffer from narcissism and psychopathic, and all of the personality disorders. You find that all of these things are comorbid. The depression, the suicide, all of the issues are all there, and these all go back down into the childhood, where there was a childhood issue. So, for example, let's take a look over here with ADHD, right? So I've got ADHD, just as a matter of interest to show you guys, yeah, right? Childhood ADHD and the emergence of personality disorders in adolescence, a prospective follow-up study, right? So methods, here are the results. Individuals diagnosed with childhood ADHD are at increased risk for personality disorders in late adolescence, specifically borderline, antisocial, avoidant, narcissistic, personality disorders. But there can be overlap with others. We'll go through the list of all the personality disorders now, and we'll discuss that. There's a lot of overlap. Those with persistent ADHD were at higher risk for antisocial, paranoia, personality disorders when compared to those in whom ADHD had remitted, but not on the other personality. So what they're finding is that those with whom the ADHD persists, right, into adulthood, rather than resolving itself in childhood, they say if you have children with ADHD in general, have increased risk for all these personality disorders. Now, what they have not realized is that the ADHD is not actually resolving itself. The ADHD is morphing into a personality disorder later on in life. That's what's actually happening. And then those for whom the ADHD persists, that it persists, there's obviously problems with that, and then those individuals will have subclinical traits of some of the personality disorders and stuff like that, and that's things that we had to try and get into. So, for example, there's a lot of people that think ADHD sort of doesn't exist. It's because it's poorly understood, it's poorly researched and stuff like that. But there is one individual, I read a book of his recently. His name is Gabor Mate. I'm going to link to him just now. He's a physician, and he really deals with the ADHD issue perfectly. Yes, it is overdiagnosed, yes, it is overmedicated, but no, it's not true that it doesn't exist. It actually is a disorder, and it's a developmental issue. It's a developmental issue, which then why it's comorbid with other disorders later on in life. If we go here, these are the personality disorders. There are 10 in total. And cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C, right? So cluster A, there's odd, bizarre, eccentric. These are just general sort of things. So paranoid, schizoid, schizotypical, right? Schizotypical. Schizotypal, think of Mark Zuckerberg. Sort of a schizotypical, schizoid, these sort of thing. Think of a Mark Zuckerberg, where his interview with the U.S. Parliament or whatever it was, where he's just deadpan. There's no emotion, there's no expression, nothing, right? And those tend to be those highly almost autistic nerdy types that can write these ridiculous computer programs and computer algorithms and stuff like that sort of thing. So yeah, I think sort of Mark Zuckerberg in that sort of thing. Cluster B, personality just disordered, the dramatic and the erratic. So antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissist. By the way, these four are on the increase. You can ask any psychologist on the planet today, and every single one of them will tell you that these four and personality disorders are increasing exponentially in the world today, specifically because of social media. Social media is a fine place for narcissism, for and all these kinds of things. Histrionic disorder, borderline, perfect place for these kinds of personality disorders. And you see these personality disorders a lot within the social justice movement, specifically histrionic. Histrionic is inappropriate sexual. So, for example, if you think about your gay pride parades, right? Gay pride parade is literally the only time in which you can dress in a sexually inappropriate manner and go walk around in the streets without getting arrested, right? If you think about it, if you think about all of the gay pride, the LGBT pride, all of the parades, these are and you think it's just nothing but absolute inappropriate attention seeking and inappropriate sexual conduct and sexualization of themselves and the children and stuff like that. Men and women walking around in BDSM and stuff like that out in the streets. It's completely inappropriate. And so you see then these things are actually there. And the way, like, if you try to talk to a social justice warrior, right, you try to talk to some of these social justice warriors and they completely freak out. There's no rationality whatsoever, nothing. Right, that's typical of borderline, that's typical of narcissism, that's typical of histrionic personality disorder, to just flip out completely and just go, which is why the social justice group warrior movements are so effective at lynching people. Right, even people within if they disagree with something someone says, they go and they protest. They go and there's this cancel culture, so they go and they shut down speakers. They block traffic. They vandalize things completely, totally go out of their minds. And that is a lot of what's going on there. Is these personality disorders being manifested for everyone to see in the public eye. And then you've got cluster C, you're anxious and fearful. So you've got your avoidant personality disorder, dependent and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. These are the ones that keep on asking for safe spaces, right? If you look again in the social justice movement and all that kind of stuff, all of the people asking for safe spaces, it's because of those the people that are constantly fearful, high neuroticism, very fearful individuals and stuff like that. And again, that's out there for the whole world to see. It's really a dramatic thing. And so even though people should, right, and this is where the distinction lies, even though people should fight against the ideology, the activism, and give it no quarter whatsoever, however, at an individual level, you can't treat the individuals that way, because the individuals are legitimately, right? They're not doing this for no reason. There's a reason why they're like that. There's a reason why these people are like that. It's because they were injured. Think about it. If we think about it in a multi-generational, let's think about it in the multi-generational cycle of abuse context, right? What happened in the 60s? From the 60s onwards, you had a complete abandonment of traditional family values. Not only were the husbands free to be as narcissistic as possible, to sleep around, so you have the free sex movement and stuff like that. So you have illegitimate children, you have narcissistic men running around, they can sleep with whoever they want, and so on and so forth. Can focus on their careers because they can sleep with whoever they want, have no responsibility. The woman can just get an abortion and they can focus on their careers. Or they can just abandon the woman altogether because the woman will be looked after by the welfare state, right? Woman, free sex, woman go out into the workforce. So the not only was the father previously away in the workforce, right? And many fathers failed right? Many fathers failed. They were unloving to their wives. They were unloving to their children, and this caused a lot of problems. And then the wives started becoming, the women started agitating because they want to go out and work and all these kinds of things. So the woman now abandoned the household as well. Who's left? It's the children. And the children are raised by who? The children are raised by television. The children are raised by their peers. The children are raised by everyone else other than the parents. And that primary attachment figure, right, which is supposed to be your mother and your father, that is broken. And so you have, then it's going to be a proliferation. So what we are seeing today is the explosion as a result of the consequence of a multi-generational breakdown of the family unit, where the children are no longer given the proper attachment, the proper nourishment. Women no longer want to breastfeed, for example. Breastfeeding isn't just about feeding the child. It's about bonding with the child, looking at the child, bonding with the child. The child is looking in the mother's face, and the child can tell if the mother would rather be somewhere else. The child can tell. The child can tell if the mother is stressed, which is why some babies are difficult to feed. Why? Because they know the mother doesn't want to be there, right? Because of these high stresses. And now, because of the economic situations, some mothers are forced, because of the financial situation, to go to work. So basically abandon their children in order to go to work, and the children are left with nannies, with au pairs and all these kinds of stuff, secondary caregivers. So if you think about the 60s, so at the moment we've got some right at the moment we are between the third and the fourth generations, right? Because for some of us, our parents were young during the 60s, and for some of us, our grandparents were young during the 60s. So we are now already in the third and fourth generation of the consequence of the free love, free sex, free alcohol. Listen to your animal instincts as much as you want. Abandon the family home. Focus more on your career than anything else. Focusing on your career is a narcissistic trait. Narcissists, psychopaths, and things like that prioritize generally, and even people with subclinical traits and stuff like that, which is why it's typically men that do it. They will prioritize the work over the family environment, the work over the home, acquiring that materialistic nature, which is why narcissistic people and stuff do so well in those things. So this is all a multi-generational thing. What you're seeing in the world today, with all this LGBT movement, this safe spaces, the social justice warriors, all of these people that are constantly going hysterical and wanting the world to just be loved, and literally acting like children. Because what a lot of people don't understand, when you are abused, right, whatever age at which the trauma occurs, the trauma stops the development. It's like it puts a cap on it, and that aspect of you doesn't develop, right? Even into adult, it doesn't develop. So basically, we've got a whole bunch of adults running around in the world, adults, university, sort of early young adults and adults running around with undeveloped characters, undeveloped emotional techniques, undeveloped reasoning techniques and stuff like that. Why? Because the parents are no longer at home. The child needs to attach to someone. So what do? They attach to the only person that's available. That's their friends. So basically, children are being educated by other children, but the problem is your education is being received from someone who's immature. So the development doesn't happen. Back in the days, if we look like beyond the 50s, beyond the 60s and beyond the 50s, children and adults used to coexist for the most part, right? The presence of adults in the lives of children, uncles, aunts, all these kinds of things was a lot more prevalent. So the children had this adult intermingling, not an exclusive child intermingling. Nowadays you have this great divide between the adults and the children, and the two almost never meet, right? It's a tragedy, and that is bad for the children. That is very, very bad for the children. Now look here, right? High prevalence of mental disorders and comorbidity in Geneva gay men's health study, right? So the results, nearly half the sample fulfilled the criteria for at least one of the 5 DSM-5 disorders. So-and-so had major depression, specific and or social phobia, alcohol drug dependence disorder, and so on and so. 1/4 of the cases were comorbid with another kind of disorder, and 35.7 consulted healthcare professional in the past 12 months. Now, the rhetoric, as I've said before, the rhetoric of the activist movement is these people are suffering because society rejects them. It's wrong. These people are like that because their parents rejected them, because their parents screwed them up. It has nothing to do with society, right? It has to do because their parents screwed them up. Society might have screwed up the parents in the sense where, let's say you have parents who because of a depression, of a recession or something like that, the parents were very stressed, and so because the parents were very stressed, they would have been a bit neglectful of the child, and even when present with the child, they would have had their focus or their attention on something else. The child will sense that disconnect, and the child will then not bond correctly, and so the environmental pressures are there. And we find also that there is a high so for example, if you have a personality disorder, guaranteed one of your parents has a personality disorder, almost guaranteed, because these things pass on. Narcissistic parents create narcissistic children. Borderline parents pass it on to their children. ADHD parents pass it on to their children, and so on and so forth, right? There's a high prevalence. So there is both a genetic predisposition as well as an environment. And we need to understand, people always argue about, is it nature or is it nurture? The answer is both. Your nature, which is your genetics, can predispose you, but it's not determinism. It doesn't mean you will. Okay, so you might be predisposed, but if you have a loving and properly nourishing environment, then your genes, right? So you've got something called epigenetics, which is a process which basically switches certain genes on and off. Okay, so depending on the environment will then determine at an epigenetic level which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off, right? So your disposition is you have the gene there which can be turned on, right? But it's the environment that determines whether that gene will be activated or not, and whether you will have a particular issue. And the gene is not necessarily for narcissism, whatever the case might be. The gene is for sensitivity. You will find that in every single one of these people, what you have is a crisis of sensitivity. What do I mean? The fact of the matter is the people that are the most effective are those that are most sensitive, right? And what do I mean by sensitive? People and it is very commonly said of people with personality disorders, not so much of narcissistic and psychopathic and stuff like that, but of others, where they have they're highly empathic people, right? They're very sensitive to the environmental. So if you take a person with any one of the, like a borderline or whatever the case might be, or ADHD, even homosexuals and stuff like that, transgender, they're very sensitive to what's happening in the environment, which is why the social justice warriors are always blaming the environment. Okay, that's why they're always blaming the environment. They're always their response to why there is a problem is always it's the environment, it's the social situation, it's that social pressure on us, right? The reason being is because the people that have these disorders are highly sensitive. They're highly attuned to the emotions and the sensibilities of others, and the tone that is carried in an environment. And because of that, as children, they were then very sensitive to the stresses and the problems of the parents, and as a result their brain development, because remember, we develop most of our development happens outside. Most of our brain development happens outside of the womb once we're born. And so while that development is happening, the child is very sensitive, is detecting the problems in the parents, the problems in the environment, and then the brain develops in order to form these coping mechanisms in order to survive that environment. And then the children are being highly sensitive, go out in the world. The children being highly sensitive will do one of two things. They either carry on being highly sensitive, and develop a highly reactive personality like borderline and histrionic and all these kinds of things, or in order to protect that sensitivity, they shut it down completely, they close it off, and then they become and then they lose that ability to feel the emotions of others. They block it off. So it's not because they're not sensitive, they are sensitive, but it's shut down. And then those children tend to are then the ones who become narcissists, who become psychopaths and stuff like that, because they shut it down, they close it off. It's just a different type of coping mechanism. It's a different strategy. So if you think about it, imagine a ray of light hits a prism, and then the prism splits the light into different colors. It's the same thing with trauma. So trauma hits the individual, and the individual's personality will then determine how the trauma is then expressed in the individual's personality. And then as it's expressed, it will have its behavioral issues. You cannot heal the person by attending to the behavioral issues. You have to attend to the person at the source of the trauma, at the root of the trauma, not the behavior. The behavior is just a symptom. That's all it is. It's just a symptom. If it's like putting a band-aid. So if you, for example, if your child is acting up and you say to the child, stop doing that, or I'm going to give you a hiding, right? The child will comply because they're afraid of the hiding, but you have not changed the root cause. You have not changed the behavior. All right, because once that child grows up, what will that child realize? That child will learn from that experience, say that if I disapprove of someone's behavior, it is acceptable for me to assault them in order to modify people's behavior. So when you say to the child, don't do that, otherwise you'll get a hiding, or don't do that, or else I will do whatever, the child learns from that behaviors that I disapprove of can be modified by the use of threat, by the use of violence and stuff like that. And those children grow up and then use that in the overall society. And that is why you see with the social justice warriors, when they disapprove of something, what do? They use threat, they use violence, like Antifa and all these people. They use threat, they use violence, they start screaming and shouting, they shut down the venues where people want to speak. They go completely crazy, and all they're doing is reflecting what was done to them by their parents when they were children, because that's how their parents treated them. And they learned, well, then this is the way we express ourselves. It's terrible. It really, really is terrible. So this whole thing of pray the gay away is a lot of absolute garbage, right? When you pray, you ask God, help me to understand my flaws and my weaknesses, and help me to seek out the best way to go and develop my character so that I can change, so I can be a better person. Right? That's what you're praying for. You are not praying for God to magically just take it away, because there's no character development that takes place. None whatsoever. Right? And I hear so many stories about gay people in the church where they're like, they will go all their lives just ignoring it or trying to pray it away. And eventually they will get into their 30s or their 40s and they'll completely give up. Right? Completely give up, and then they will leave the church and they will leave God and say, well, God didn't answer my prayer, and this and this and that, and I've been rejected, and so to hell with the church and to hell with God and to hell with all these things. Why? Because they never ever address, because you don't ignore problems. You can't ignore problems. You've got to get to the root of the problem. You've got to get to the root source. Why did you end up becoming a certain way? What happened in your childhood? Deal with the issues in your childhood. Did you feel accepted by your parents? Did you feel loved by your parents, right? And I resonate with that sort of thing. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the words, I love you. And I looked at the person, and in my heart, in my mind, I said, I don't believe you, right? And I had to stop myself, right? Because if I didn't believe the person, my reaction, because you develop like an emotional allergy to certain things, right? So, and if a person said, I love you, or if a person tried to give me a compliment, I would react badly to that, like almost like an allergic reaction, because in my mind, the person was lying to me, and liars need to be punished, need to be whatever. And I had to figure that out in my mind and change that and be like, hang on, maybe there's something within me that's unable to accept that. It's maybe they're not lying, maybe they're telling the truth, but I can't accept it. And I had to go into my roots. Why don't I believe this? And I had to sort all those things out. And then as a result, then my behavior improved as I understood who I was. And then when that emotional reaction welled up within me, I then had the knowledge to say, whoa, 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 hang on. You're overreacting here. Don't go off, because growing up, I was very aggressive. I was very confrontational and stuff like that. I had to realize you can't be that way. You can't be that way. You can't fight with everyone. You've got to be nicer, right? Not everyone is an enemy, okay? Here's another one. Sexual orientation is relation to mental disorders and suicide attempts, right? So again, I have to really, really try to emphasize this. The sexual orientation is not causing the mental disorder. The mental disorder is causing the sexual orientation is a result, just of the mental disorder. It's the other way around. Some people, and this is the problem with a lot of the medical thinking these days, where correlation is not causation. Often people have the cause and effect the wrong way around. Okay? So in the same way that aggression doesn't cause the mental disorder, the mental disorder causes aggression, it's the same thing. It's not the sexual orientation that causes, it's not the sexual orientation and people's reaction to that causes the mental disorder. It's the mental disorder that causes the sexual orientation and then the way they behave when people reject them or whatever the case might be, sort of thing, because they weren't, and it traces back. And then the mental disorder itself is there because of things that happen in the childhood, in the development of the individual, sort of thing. So we mustn't be running around trying to smash these people like as if they had a choice, right? And in a lot of ways, the gay community did itself no favors by saying it's my choice, I can do whatever I want. Because if you talk to any gay person, talk to any heterosexual person, when did you choose to be a heterosexual? They'll say, well, I never chose that. No one wakes up one day and decides, right? There are cases, right? I know women who in their 40s, after having children, having a husband and stuff like that, they were never lesbian, but in their 30s and 40s become lesbian. Why? Because they were in an abusive relationship with the husband, but because they crave an attachment, a meaningful attachment and relationship with someone so badly, and the abusive relationship with the husband was so severe that they can no longer bring themselves to be with another man. But because the drive to be in a relationship is so overwhelming, they then resort to then being in a relationship with a woman to try and satisfy what she never got from the male, because the maleness became distasteful. Right? And so you do have late onsets of these things as well, where people can become gay or lesbian later on in life, right? Because of certain things. And even transgender, you do get late onset transgender. And again, they found that people who are not transgender as children, but who's sort of like in their 20s and 30s suddenly realize, oh, I think I'm transgender, and then transition, they find that usually what causes that to kick off is a high stress episode in their lives, similar to what starts a person becoming a serial killer. If you look at the statistics, if you look at like FBI profilers and stuff, there is always a massive stressor before a person becomes a serial killer. If you study their lives, you could see that they were at risk for becoming a serial killer. But what starts them off becoming a serial killer is usually a major stressor episode in their lives, which knocks them off the horse, and then they become a serial killer. And then they start going off. So loss of a job, divorce in the marriage, broken marriage, it was some major traumatic event as an adult, and then they go off, sort of thing. So these major stressors that kick in and then send the person right off the rails. So all of these things are all interrelated. They're all interconnected, right? And if you ask psychologists, right, one of the criticisms people have about the diagnostic statistics manual is that they knock it because it's trying to too neatly categorize and everything, and there's so much overlap. So how do you know these things are real? And the DSM-5 is fine, right? It's fine. The categories and stuff like that are helpful to help people form a theory of the issue, right? It helps in understanding. But if you talk to any mental health practitioner of any kind, they will always tell you these things. Like, or if you go back to the cluster disorders, let's have a look here, right? All three of these, they all are comorbid. So you can have avoidant, you can be clinically, you can be diagnosed, right, as avoidant, but you can also have subclinical traits of any one of the rest as well. They all are comorbid with each other. Traits, they overlap in the way they present a lot. And you can talk to any clinician, you will find, which is why homosexuality overlaps with depression. It's why ADHD overlaps with depression. Okay, they all overlap with depression. It's why borderline overlaps with depression, sort of thing. And it's why all of these things overlap with drug use and impulse control problems and alcoholism, etc., etc. Narcissism overlaps with alcohol abuse. So does ADHD. So does homosexuality. They're finding people in the gay community massive rates of alcoholism and drug abuse. They're all related. It's all coming from the same place, right? It's all a consequence of multi-generational abuse, right? Here they're talking so suicide attempts and stuff like that. Results: compared with heterosexual counterparts, lesbians, bisexual women demonstrated a threefold increased likelihood of substance abuse disorders. Gay and bisexual men showed twice the rate of anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, even after accounting for mental disorder and comorbidity. So it shows that the homosexuality is not, the homosexuality is a symptom, is one of the many symptoms of the personality disorders. And the problem is, because people identify with their sexual orientation, which you shouldn't do. You're not just your sexual orientation. Come on, right? You could actually become androgynous and still be the same person, right? So you need to understand that your character, who you are, has nothing to do with your sexuality per se, necessarily, right? Because the Bible says that when we go to heaven one day, we're given new bodies and stuff like that, those sexual relations won't happen anymore. Okay, won't happen anymore. Will be like the angels, who themselves are asexual. The angels aren't gendered. The Bible talks about refers to the angels using masculine language, but that's because of the old traditional way of using the masculine gender of words to denote something that's very powerful and so on and so forth. But it's not because they themselves are gendered, right? They don't have a sex in the way we understand genitals and that kind of thing. You know, it's not the same thing. So your character is a separate issue, right? So we need to be very, very sensitive to these issues. There's people are suffering, right? So there we go. I will put all of these things up in the links. Sexual orientation and its relation to mental disorders. Suicide. Hang on, didn't I just read that one? All right, sorry, I doubled that up. So here I want to go through a couple of quotes, right? First of all, here's this guy, Gabor Mate. Books. Let's go here. Right, I've read this book here, Scattered Minds. Right, The Origins and Healing of Attention Deficit Disorder. Excellent book. This guy basically, he knows his thing. Talks all about trauma in children when they were young. Now here's an interesting thing, right? This is for those of you who are Seventh-day Adventists. This lady, Ellen White, is a prophet of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, right? So to explain, the Seventh-day Adventist Church views her in the same way we view doctors of the church. So she's like the Saint Augustine of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, so to speak, right? and other inspired individuals of different churches, like what Martin Luther is to the Lutherans, and so on and so forth. Some of these people had visions from God, some of them had prophecies from God, some of them didn't, some of them were just very inspired writers and all that kind of stuff. So that's pretty much where, for the Seventh-day Adventists, that's pretty much where Ellen White ranks. Just as a matter of, that's where she sort of ranks. She's outside of the canon. She's not, we don't consider her to be canon, right? The canon is closed. But here's things that she started writing already back in the 19th century, right? What she wrote, and this is already now to articulate. So here we go. The power of heredity. Consider the power of heredity, the influence of evil associations in the surroundings, the power of wrong habits. Can we wonder that under such influences many become degraded? Can we wonder that they should be slow to respond to efforts for their uplifting? And we see this in the LGBT community. The LGBT community absolutely refuses any help whatsoever. We must just leave them be, and they want to carry on the way they are. Right? All of them, the transgender, everything, right? She wrote this in a book in Ministry of Healing in 1905. Now, ladies and gentlemen, understand the following, right? Mendel, who was the first one to start articulating stuff about how the law of heredity, basically through genetics, he only started doing this in about 1866, right? And then about 3 decades later, his work on heredity, and then the whole genetic movement, the understanding of sort of the genetics and heredity, then sort of blossom from there. So when Ellen White is writing this, she's writing this basically at the same time and even before his work became public, right? Now what Mendel discovered is something, he basically articulated what people have always known, that if you take all the woolliest sheep in your herd and you breed them, they will produce the woolliest sheep. So we've always understood, right, that on a physical, biological level, that we inherit the physical traits of our parents. We've always understood that. That's been no mystery. And what the science of genetics has revealed to us has basically the mechanism of why that is the case. Okay. Now, what Ellen White is talking about here is not merely a reference to that, but she's also describing how the parent's character, the personality, gets transferred. The cycle of violence from generation to generation gets transferred from generation to generation. No one has ever thought about that before, right? Only now, with individuals like Gabor Mate and much of the most recent psychological literature and discoveries that we're finding, only now are we realizing, like 200 years later virtually, that even in the womb, the child is already being influenced by the personality of the mother in terms of development. And we're only beginning to cotton on to this idea now, right? And Ellen White and this is one of the reasons why I personally believe that she was an inspired individual, because she was pointing this out already in the 1950s, in the 1850s, 1860s, 1880s, and so on and so forth. So we're going to go through a few quotes here, right? Children often inherit disposition. As a rule, children inherit the dispositions and tendencies of the... Now, Ellen White was not the only one to ever pick up on this. There are other writers who do, right? Their parents and imitate their example, so that the sins of the parents are practiced by the children from generation to generation. Thus, the violence and irreverence of Ham, which is why the story is there in the Bible, were reproduced in his posterity, bringing a curse upon them for many generations. On the other hand, how richly rewarded was Shem's respect for his father, and what an illustrious line of holy men appears in his posterity, Patriarchs and Prophets. This was her book, published in 1890. Okay? Mothers should inform themselves of the law of heredity. Like, one thing that kills me is to see women walk around smoking and drinking Red Bull and alcohol while they're pregnant. Even today, we're too stupid to realize this, right? So not only that, but your attitude, your character, which is why the character of the individual you choose to marry and have children with is the single most important decision you will ever make. Right? By that decision, you will condemn yourself and every generation that comes after you. Take note, right? If you choose a crappy wife or a crappy husband and you have children with this person, you are condemning yourself to a life of misery at the hands of that person. You are condemning your children to a life of misery at the hands of that person. And you are condemning your children to suffer for the rest of their lives from the effects of being raised by such a person. And their children after them and their children after them for generations. Right? We need to understand this. Mothers should inform themselves on the laws of heredity. So this was in 1865. So this was whilst Mendel was still performing his experiments. In the past generations, if mothers had informed themselves in regards to the laws of their being, they would have understood that their constitutional strength, as well as the tone of their morals and their mental faculties, would in a great measure be represented in their offspring. Their ignorance upon the subject, where so much is involved, is criminal. Right? So we can see what Ellen White's attitude is. Disease transmitted from parents to children. Through the successive generations since the fall, the tendency has been continually downward. Disease has been transmitted from parents to children, generation after generation. Even infants in the cradle can suffer from afflictions caused by the sins of the parents. We did not realize this until recently. Right? Which is why in recent years, they've discovered that children who have been abandoned and stuff in hospitals, they get the nurses to go and hold the babies because they've realized you can give the baby the finest care, medical care on the planet. But if loving women do not come into the ward and hold the babies will die. Okay? Only recently have we cottoned onto this fact. And so now there are movements within the medical and psychological field encouraging women to breastfeed. We're not encouraging women to breastfeed because we're wanting to make women feel guilty or because we're trying to be funny or arbitrary. No, so your child depends on it, right? Your child's well-being depends on it, not only on being fed, but on the connection and the bond which is formed, which is why when they're born, they're handed, as soon as humanly possible, they're handed to their mothers, right? To hold, bond, right? Because if you don't bond, the child gets screwed up. You screw up your child, right? And we have how many mothers today that don't give a damn? Right? The child is crying. What did they say? What is the advice that people give today? The child is crying. Let him cry. Self-soothe. No. No. You go. And why do people want these parenting techniques? Because they want to save time. Because they're selfish. Because they want to go to work. Because they want to go do this. They want to chase careers. If you have children, you need to realize that your children are a full-time job. And your children will continue being a full-time job for the next 30 years. Right? At least the next 18 to 20 years. Full-time job. A child at the age of 16 to 18 does not need their parents less than a child at the age of 5 or 6 or 4 or 3. They still need their parents, the influence of their parents. It's a full-time job. It's a hell of a job. But people are going out there having children, right, as if it's nothing, right? And I will have my child, and then I'll have my little business on the side, right? And while I'm on my business, I've left my children there with the nanny or with whatever the case might be, because I'm off attending to my business because I'm more interested in me rather than my children. It's ridiculous. And then we wonder why do we have the problems today that we have today? Even infants in the cradle suffer from afflictions caused by the sins of the parents. Moses, the first historian, gives quite a definite account of social and individual life in the early days of the world's history, so before the flood. But we find no record that an infant was born blind, deaf, crippled, or imbecile. This is very old language, right? Not an instance is recorded of a natural death in infancy, childhood, or early manhood. It was so rare for a son to die before his father that such an occurrence was considered worthy of record. Haran died before his father Terah. The patriarchs from Adam to Noah, with few exceptions, lived nearly 1,000 years. Since then, the average length of life has been decreasing. At the time of Christ's first advent, the race had already so generated that not only the old, but the middle-aged and the young were brought from every city to the Savior to be healed of their diseases. Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, 1890, Counsels on Diet and Food. Right? Children, this is where the responsibility comes in, right? Because, oh, I was raised that way. It's my culture. Rubbish, right? Children to avoid the wrong habits of parents. Disease never comes without a cause. The way is prepared and disease invited by disregard of the laws of health. Many suffer in consequence of the transgression of their parents. While they are not responsible for what their parents have done, it is nevertheless their duty to ascertain what are and what are not violations of the laws of health. They should avoid the wrong habits of their parents and by correct living place themselves in better conditions. Ministry of Healing. Try and be better than what your parents were. And more often than not, because when we're growing up, we always, how many people say when they're growing up, I will never be like my parents. I don't want to be like my parents. And then we grow up and we find ourselves repeating the same mistakes. Because it's hard work. The reason why we do that is because it's hard work to change those things in ourselves. And our parents, because the adults wanting to escape the guilt, refuse to accept these things. So, oh, you're a bad child, right? How many of you watching this video have been told and how many do you hear about other people? You were a bad child. You would deserve to be punished and stuff like that. I've heard it, right? You hear it, right? You were 10 years old. You were 10 years old. What? You didn't know anything. How could you have been different? Right? You were the character you had as a child was the one given to you by your parents. Who's the one that molds you? The parents. And so if you are a parent watching this, you better watch out, because every single flaw that you have will be replicated in your children if you're not careful. And it's painful for you to recognize that in yourself. And those of you who are parents, if you've got children, is there anything you hate in your children? There's a guy, Jordan Peterson. He said something very profound once. He says, never let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. Right? I would go further, and I would go as far as to say is, if there is anything in your children that you dislike, it's your fault. Because where did they learn it from? Well, who's the only one there to teach them? Is you. And if you were not the one around to teach them better, then it's again your fault because you weren't around. You're not going to be around. Why are you going to have children? We need to realize the great responsibility. Societies collapse because of children whose parents failed to raise them properly, and individuals who do not correct the sins of their ancestry in themselves in order so that they can be better parents and to take responsibility for their actions and for who they are and what they do. Right, so I'm going to put these links up there. Here we go. Prenatal influences. Until now, no one has ever spoken of this. This woman was way ahead of her time. The importance of prenatal influences. The effect of prenatal influences is by many parents looked upon as a matter of little moment. But heaven does not so regard it. The message sent by an angel of God and twice given in the most solemn manner shows it to be deserving of our most careful thought. The ministry of healing. A contented spirit affects offspring. Every woman about to become a mother, whatever may be her surrounding, should encourage constantly a happy, cheerful, contented disposition. And again, we understand that it's difficult. I mean, think of what it was like. Think of what it was like for women during the First World War and the Second World War and the Great Depression and stuff like that. So There is a limit to what we can do, but these are the principles that we need to understand. By her surroundings, should encourage constantly a happy and cheerful, contented disposition, knowing that for all her efforts in this direction, she will be repaid tenfold in the physical as well as in the moral character of her offspring. Nor is this all. By habit, she can accustom herself to cheerful thinking and thus encourage a happy state of mind and cast a cheerful reflection in her own happiness of spirit upon her family and those with whom she associates. And in a very great degree, her physical health will be improved. A force will be imparted to the life springs, the blood will not move sluggishly, as would be the case if she were to yield to despondency and gloom. Her mental and moral health are invigorated by the buoyancy of her spirits. The Review and Herald, July 25, 1899, counsels on health. Right? Feminism does exactly the opposite of everything. Feminism teaches women to be envious, hateful, fear-mongering, complaining, bitchy, awful. Men have their sins, by the way. Men have their sins, because let me tell you, even though the verses here mention the mother and stuff like that, because it's talking about prenatal influences, it talks about men as well. I posted a quote the other day. Let me see if I can find it, where Ellen White talks about the stupidity of what men do to their of what men do to their kids. Right, let me find that quote for you here. Come on. Here we go. So this is the Facebook page for my ministry. Right, here we go. Let me blow it up a little bit. The Adventist Home. Right. Husbands should merit love and affection. Husbands should merit, not demand, not insist, not require, should merit love and affection. If the husband is tyrannical, exacting, critical of the actions of his wife, he cannot hold her respect and affection, and the marriage relation will become odious to her. She will not love her husband because he does not try to make himself lovable. Husbands should be careful, attentive, constant, faithful, and compassionate. They should manifest love and sympathy. When the husband has the nobility of character, purity of heart, elevation of mind that every true Christian must possess, it will be made manifest in the marriage relation. He will seek to keep his wife in health and courage. He will strive to speak words of comfort to create an atmosphere of peace in the home circle. Husbands, love your wives and be not harsh with them. Colossians 3:19. There's that post of mothers. Here we go, is another one. This is now Richard Baxter, who was a Protestant, one of the famous Protestants. Right, look what he says, the following here. Great duty of husbands and wives to live in quietness and peace, and avoid all occasions of wrath and discord. Because this is a duty of so great importance, I shall first open to you the great necessity of it, and then give you more particular directions to perform it. Your discord will be your pain and the vexation of your lives. And he goes on. So go to my Facebook page. Right. Right. There's my Facebook page. Some Christian guy. Go check it out. I post quotes, and stuff like that. So we need to understand, ladies and gentlemen, that this pray away the gay stupidity, this pray away the depression, pray away the narcissism. That's all a lot of garbage. Can't be done. God can help. God can bring healing. If God wanted to, he could snap his fingers and boom, do it away. But God recognizes that there is a characterological development that needs to happen. Right? You can't just go boom, click, and all better, and those issues remain unresolved. Why? Because those, even if you could reverse everything, those unresolved issues would quickly re-corrupt you. right? You have to address those issues in life. So this conversion therapy, this electrical shock therapy, all that kind of stupidity, right? Forget about the behavior. Forget about the behavior, whether it's homosexuality, whether it is aggression, whether it is whatever. We understand that there are certain measures we need to take. If a person is aggressive, obviously you can't have them around. They have to stop being aggressive. So within reason, I understand. But worry less about the behavior and worry more about what's causing it. The drug use, the suicide, all these kinds of things. And you will not resolve the issue if you do not convince the individual that you actually care about them, that you actually accept them for who they are. And they need to be reminded that the disorder is not who they are. You are not your disorder. You can say to a person, I love you, and still disagree with what they're doing. Okay? And us as individuals, those of us who have issues, we need to stop identifying ourselves with our issues, with our culture. For example, right? Being a Brazilian, I cannot tell you how many times in my life I heard the word, because it's our culture, or it's our Latino passion, as an excuse for abuse. I cannot tell you how many times I heard that. The Latino passion and our culture was used as an excuse. Not only an excuse for their abuse, but the excuse to never correct the behavior. Because people they identify themselves with their culture. Be an individual and come away from those things, right? Stop the cycle of violence, the generational abuse. Otherwise, the world is going to go to hell in a handbasket. It's going to be demolished. You've got to come right? And stop worrying about I have the right to have as much sex as I want. You're hurting yourself. There is this mantra where people say, oh, I can do whatever I want so long as I'm not hurting anyone. You are hurting at least one person. You're hurting yourself. And you're selfish for doing so. Because by hurting yourself, you're going to hurt other people. And the thing is, when you say that I can do whatever I want as long as I'm hurting someone else, you are assuming, you're being arrogant. You're assuming that you know for sure that what you're doing is not going to hurt someone else. How do you know? You have no idea. You have no idea. And you don't care to know, which is why you say that. As long as it's not hurting anyone else. It's not because you're not saying that because you actually know whether you're not hurting other people. You actually, that phrase is a translation, is another way of saying, I don't care. I just want to do whatever I want to do. And you must leave me alone because I have the right to do it. We must forget about what we have the right to do and start thinking about what we should do so that we can put ourselves in a better position than our parents gave us. So that we can put our children in a better position, so we could put our society and our communities in a better position. So we can stop all this pain, this cycle of violence. Stop it, right? We go on out there, anti-bully, zero tolerance against bullies and stuff like that. Why do you think a bully is a bully? It's because he's being bullied at home. You think shouting at him and shaming him, right? We go around, oh, don't fat shame, which is correct, by the way. You shouldn't fat shame. It's actually correct, right? The problem is when they're saying you shouldn't fat shame, they're using the fact that you shouldn't shame as an excuse for continuing their bad habits. It's correct. Yes, you shouldn't fat shame. But it is also correct that you should improve your health so you don't die. And it is also correct that you have no business promoting an unhealthy lifestyle, because if you do that, then you're going to condemn other people to unhealthy lifestyle and death. You have a responsibility to look at yourself. Why am I overweight? Do I have an eating disorder? I have an eating problem. Do I have an improper relationship with food? If so, why? It's because of anxiety. I'm trying to medicate my anxiety. Why do I have anxiety? And go and do the work. All of this, the obesity epidemic, all of the disease, all of the mind issues, all of the everything. It's true. You shouldn't shame people. You get nowhere if you shame a fat person. You get nowhere if you shame a gay person. You get nowhere if you shame a bully. You will not change the behaviors like that. In fact, the reason they are that way is because they were shamed as children in the first place. That's why they are like that. Because all of these things with the depression and all that kind of stuff, one of the major underlying emotions that people feel that have these things is shame. And shame is a pain state, right? Which is why if you take opioids, it helps, right? All of these addictions that we have is basically people trying to get away from the pain. And if you don't help people sort out the pain, right, it is wrong for you to say to the person, fine, go ahead, because you hate them. Like the LGBT community, just let them go and let them be. Yeah, they have the right to do that, sure. But if you care about these people, you will say to them, listen, we understand that you're like this and you're suffering depression and suicide and all that kind of stuff, because that's a cry for help. All of these things, from the bully all the way to the narcissist at the CEO. The narcissist, we love to hate the narcissist. We love to hate the narcissist. We love to hate the psychopath. But remember, no one chose to be that way. It's hard. We want to hate these people because they hurt us. Right? Hell, believe me, I know. I struggled with this for many years, and it still flares up sometimes. You want to hate these people, but at the same time, you have to feel compassion. They didn't ask to be that way. They're that way because they were tortured into it. And so, ladies and gentlemen, if you're a Christian, get your head on straight about these issues and stop being so ignorant. Get right. Don't just say a person. When a person hears to you, when you say to a person, pray about it. Do you want to know what they hear? They hear, I don't care. That's what they hear. Right? Take 5 minutes and sit down with the person. Say, so, tell me about yourself. Right? I get grief from all sides of the fence. I've got friends. I've shared a house with a transgender person. I've actually lived in the same house with a transgender person, gay friends and stuff like that sort of thing. And I've done it at every single point. I've told them, listen, I disagree with that, but I accept you nevertheless. Let me talk to you and try to understand what you're all about. And every single one of them had problems in their childhood. Every last one. And they're looking for acceptance and stuff like that. Stop being an idiot. Right? So, and it's both sides. First of all, stop being an idiot by ostracizing these people and bullying these people and being a total moron about it. But at the same time, on the other side, stop pretending that this is okay. Stop pretending it's normal. Stop insisting that you have a gay clergyman or a gay whatever. You wouldn't ask for an alcoholic clergyman. You wouldn't ask for a clergyman that of any one of the personality disorders. Why would you ask? Why would you insist for gay, transgender, and all these kinds of things? Why would you do that? Right? This person's supposed to be a leader and they don't even know who they are. Right? It's a high responsibility. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that is my 2 cents on this matter. Stupid things Christians say and do, and there's no understanding. You need to go in there and understand people, what they're like and why. And until you get to the root of the problem, you can jump up and down about the behavior all you want. It's not going to go away. It's not going to go away. Yes, the behaviors might be sinful. Aggression, what, yeah, they're sinful, sure, right? But you're going to get nowhere saying, let go, you're going to go to hell. You're going to get nowhere, right? Because if the person does not feel like you actually care about them, you get nowhere with them. Get nowhere, because that's what they're missing. That's what they're missing. That's why we are like that. Those of us who are damaged. That's the reason why we like that. It's because no one cared about us in the first place. Right? You're not going to help people by not caring about them, because not caring about them is what got them into that position in the first place. You've got to stop it. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it for me. Thank you very much. Until next time, I'll see you guys later. Ciao, bye, and please read that book one more time. Check this guy out, Gabor Mate. When the Body Says No, Scattered Minds. He doesn't talk about homosexuality or anything of that sort. He just talks about trauma, childhood trauma. He talks about ADHD and how it links with Tourette's. For the first time in my life, do I now understand that Tourette's and ADHD are actually linked. Right? Hold on to your kids. Get this book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. That's what addiction is. It's a hungry ghost. It's looking for something that it didn't get when it was a child. When the Body Says No, go and get these books. One of the best reads you will ever have by this guy. Right? That's him there. He's got videos up on Facebook and stuff like that. He's excellent. He's absolutely excellent. There's some of the stuff that he talks about that I philosophically disagree with him. For example, he talks about certain Eastern meditations and stuff like that, and he seems to be into the Eastern religions a lot. I disagree with him on a philosophical level, but on a scientific medical level, I'm with him all the way with this guy. So go check his stuff out. He's fantastic, and I'm going to put all of these links in the description below. So go right ahead and check them out and do some study and wise up. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your viewership. Till next time, cheerio.